Good morning, everybody. I've got my coffee, I've got a history video, we're ready to go. I just want to say a quick thank you to everybody who has been contributing to this channel, whether you've subscribed or you've been leaving comments, teaching me things, leaving video suggestions, answering my questions. It's all very much appreciated. I literally started this channel like a week ago and it's already surpassed my expectations. So hopefully we'll keep growing and learning together. I've really been enjoying the journey so far, so keep it coming. Now the video we're going to be watching today isn't really a suggestion, it's actually my own idea because ever since I watched the History of China videos, I've been wondering about the Mongolian Empire and about Genghis Khan. Those videos only touched on him very briefly, it left a lot out, and I've heard that the Mongolian Empire could possibly be the biggest empire ever in history, but then I watched the stuff about the British Empire and it said that that was the biggest empire in history. So I'm so confused right now. I'm hoping this video will shed some light on that. Now I just searched for the Mongolian Empire on YouTube and most of the videos were like an hour long or only 5 minutes long. So I did find this one. It looks like it's just a kind of short history in 10 minutes, which is kind of the sweet spot. I hope it's good. I've never watched any videos from this channel, History Matters. So if it's not good, I apologize. We won't do any more from that channel. As far as I'm concerned, this is kind of a precursor to all of the British history and the British Empire. Not only do I want to compare this to the British Empire, but since the British Empire did become active in Asia, I think it's important to also understand the history of Asia. Alright, so I'm ready for the Mongols. Let's go.
1167 and the tribes of the steppe, roughly here, are fighting. Conflict here was limited in scale and waged between small groups of nomadic warriors who were fighting for the region's limited resources. There were many tribes, but the most important ones were the Tatars, the Karayids, and of course, the Mongols. These tribes had no formal written languages or complex hierarchy simply because they didn't need them. They were run by chieftains whose position was inherited and it was their role to keep the peace and lead the warriors into battle. The tribes of the steppe had many different religions ranging from Christianity to Buddhism, but the Mongols were Tengriists. Tengriism was very much linked with the nomadic nature of Mongol life. For example, there were no fixed religious buildings like in China or Europe in which Mongols would worship the supreme god, Tengri, who was the god of the sky. The Mongol religious leaders were shamans called Beki who would communicate with the dead on behalf of the living and also cure ailments, or at least they would attempt to because medicine back then was frankly pants.
I don't know anything about shamans, so I've heard of them before, but I don't know anything about their practices or beliefs. I guess shamans talk to dead spirits. Is that kind of what I'm understanding here?
So the late 12th century was a period of great change for the people of the steppe. For a start, the climate was much milder, meaning that there was more food for their livestock and thus for them.
What's the steppe? Is this a particular region of... It looks like it's in China, so... I don't really remember if it talks about that in the Chinese history videos or not. I feel like I've heard of it before. Maybe it was in the China videos, but it was just kind of, you know, brushed over.
You'd think that more food would mean that there'd be less raiding, but fun fact, more food was a period of great change for the people of the steppe. For a start, the climate was much milder, meaning that there was more food for their livestock and thus for them. You'd think that more food would mean that there'd be less raiding, but fun fact, no. It actually meant that herding duties could be left to the women and thus more men could be spared for other things, like war. The winner of these internomadic fights would absorb the losing tribe.
I mean, what else is there to do, right?
Which made governing more complicated, but importantly saw the power of individual chieftains grow considerably up until the turn of the 13th century. Of course, no chief would grow as great as the certain Chinggis, better known in the West as Genghis, although his birth name was Temujin. Temujin was the son of a Mongol noble who was poisoned by the Tatars and whose followers promptly abandoned him. Over many years, he built up a reputation as a skilled leader and built many enduring friendships.
So I think it was during my video reacting to the Mughal Empire where it did talk about Temujin, so I do remember that, and that Genghis Khan was kind of the son of a sort of, I don't know if it was royalty or not, but it was, you know, of more of a ruling class type family. What I'm getting from this so far is that there's not like one dominant empire at this time. It's mostly just a bunch of small, more like tribes in the region, and they seem to be very pastoral, so very agricultural.
After later rescuing his kidnapped wife, Genghis and the Mongols teamed up with the Karayids to destroy the Tatars. After his victory, Temujin then took the title Khan, meaning ruler. So now the Mongols and the Karayids were the dominant.
So that's what that means. Okay. Also, if any of you are Star Trek fans, and if you know if they named the character Khan after Genghis Khan, let me know.
dominant powers in the region, and as a result they immediately became enemies, and so those other guys had to die. Temujin and his Mongols were victorious and destroyed the Keriids before mopping up and assimilating the other nomadic groups in the area.
So pretty much
this
nobody's
was all
left.
done by 1206, when the leaders of the now quite large Mongols
Okay, so this would have been during the Middle Ages in Europe, basically. Good to know.
met at what is called a Kurultai. Here, Temujin was elected as the Khagan, meaning the Great Khan or the Khan of Khans. He also took the title Chinggis Khan, meaning fierce ruler, and so began the Mongol Empire. Side note.
Okay, so the Mongol Empire kind of began with elections. So that's a little bit different from what we've been seeing so far with a lot of these empires that have risen up.
Side note, we're going to call him Genghis instead of Chinggis in this episode because most people in the West know him as that. So now that Genghis and the Mongols were...
Chinggis. Okay, so Chinggis and Genghis are kind of... those names sound hilarious when you say them like that. So is Chinggis kind of the Asian name for him then? Do you guys in Asia still call him Chinggis Khan? Are they interchangeable, those terms? I don't know. I might be completely wrong about that. But I wonder why the West calls him Genghis. Did they just like misunderstand Chinggis and thought it was Genghis?
Mongols were dominant in the region, there were two options. Settle and live the rest of their lives in peace, or conquer literally everything. Shockingly, Genghis opted for the latter and turned his gaze south to China. It used to be entirely ruled by the Song dynasty, but at this point it was split into 3 states. The Song still ruled in the south, the north was ruled by the Jin, and in the northwest lay the kingdom of Western Jia, whom Genghis chose as his first target. By 1209, Western Jia had submitted to Genghis after he flooded the fields around its capital and ruined its crops.
So again, here's with the flooding in China. Is this the Yellow River that was flooded again? What's this thing sticking up out of the water? It looks like a dog.
It was now time to take on the Jin, who were a much more powerful foe, and they even had some large walls to keep the Mongols out. They were disconnected though, and the Mongols could simply go around them, but that was the point. It was supposed to slow invaders down and give the Chinese time to mobilise. Genghis invaded the Jin in 1211, and by 1214, after a long siege of the Jin capital, Zhongdu, nowadays called Beijing, the Jin emperor submitted. He then promptly moved his capital south to Kaifeng, which Genghis saw as a challenge, and so, back to war it was. Genghis captured and then sacked Zhongdu with the help of some Jin deserters who taught the Mongols how to siege a city before conquering this territory by 1216. The Mongols were unable to destroy the Jin house.
So I just saw that little sign, you said horses won't do much. Now I think horses were like a big deal with the Mongols. That's how they conducted their warfare primarily. So was it that the horses just weren't that effective against the Chinese armies for some reason?
Jin, however, and so Genghis left a force there and turned his attention to other lands. Genghis conquered many of the nomads to the east and then looked to this land called Khwarezm, to which he sent a trade delegation in 1218, which the Khwarezmian leader promptly put to death. This was not a clever thing to do. Genghis, now a bit angry, decided that a lot of people had to die for this. By 1227, the Khwarezmian
So it's just revenge, so he's just gonna kill all these people based on revenge.
lands were decimated and a chunk of it was absorbed into the Mongol Empire. Not all of it though, since Genghis didn't want to overstretch his forces. This is just one demonstration of how Genghis was a pragmatist, another one being that he promoted generals based upon their talents, not their birth, with Subadai, the son of a blacksmith, being the best example. Genghis would die in 1227.
It's interesting, I'm getting some different things with the Mongols here. They held elections to get their leader, and they're using merit-based promotions versus like family ties. So I'm seeing kind of a little bit of an American theme in here as well. So I'm wondering if any of the American founders got some inspiration from the Mongols, because I know a lot of them were kind of experts on history, especially like ancient history going back. So I wonder if any of these ideas kind of bled into the American way of doing things.
27 and was succeeded as Khagan by his son Ogadai. He didn't simply become Khagan like a monarch did and had to be selected by the nobles of the empire in another Kurultai in 1229.
See, another
the
election
only
type
people
thing.
who were eligible to be made Khagan were the descendants of Genghis, and whilst Ogadai was selected
never mind.
without much issue, the seeds were sown for future division. Ogadai saw to the construction of a permanent capital of the Mongol Empire, which was completed in 1235, called Karakorum. So Ogadai, much like his father, expanded the borders of the empire. In 1234, he, with the help of the Song dynasty, oversaw the final destruction of the Jin before subduing Korea. Sort of. It kept resisting. Forever. Ogadai then sent his nephew Batu under the command of Subadai to conquer lands in Europe. They did pretty well at this, conquering all of this land by 1241 and raiding Hungary and Poland. The road to Central and Western Europe lay wide open, but the Mongols didn't advance any further. One of the
Okay, I was about to say, like, why? Why did they not go further into Europe? I'm assuming, like, the armies in Europe were maybe a little bit too formidable for them, but let's see.
Reasons may have been the death of Ogadai in 1241, meaning that the Mongol nobles in Europe needed to return to Mongolia to attend a Kurultai and select a new leader. Ogadai had no clear successor lined up, and
okay, so let's just give up conquering Europe because we have to go back for a funeral, basically, and reselect a leader. Okay.
After a 5-year regency, he was succeeded by his son Guyuk, whose 2-year reign did see gains in Anatolia. This time the succession was contested, and it was Monka, Guyuk's cousin, who won out, and in 1251 he was made Great Khan. Monka cracked down on those who had opposed him and then tasked his brother Helegu with conquering the realms to the southwest. He did this with great enthusiasm.
Okay, so we're kind of moving away from the election system, and it looks like it's just a bunch of family heirs now that are taking over. That didn't last for very long.
And in 1258 Baghdad, the centre of the Islamic world, was taken and looted. Monka also conquered these territories in China surrounding the Song dynasty and also invaded Deivia, but they failed. By 1259 the Mongol Empire looked like this, and it was in this same year that Monka died during a campaign against the Song. Monka hadn't named an heir, and so 2 of his brothers emerged as rival claimants. The first was Kublai, who was proclaimed Khagan in Kaifeng, with only the nobles who supported him being there. The other was Arig Bakr, who was named Great Khan in Karakoram. Naturally, this meant civil war, and the empire was divided in its allegiance. Kublai held the immense resources and wealth of China, as well as having an ally in Helegu, who controlled this territory known as the Ilkhanate. Arig Bakr had aid from this land, called the Chagadai Khanate, and also from the European lands of the empire known as the Golden Horde. By 12...
I mean, this is just pure thirst for power. I mean, there were a lot of details skipped over in this, but you have these 2 brothers who are kind of warring for the crown, metaphorically speaking. So you go to war because you want that power and you want that authority. I mean, the egos involved are just incredible. One person's thirst for power can kill millions of people. Human pride, human ego can be super destructive if you're not careful.
By 1264, Kublai had won and Arig Bakr was imprisoned and died, but after this, the Mongol Empire would never truly be united again. The Ilkhanate and the Golden...
That year 1266 rings a bell for me in European history. I don't know why exactly. Was that around the year that the Magna Carta was signed or established or written? I don't know. I might be wrong about that.
Golden Horde were almost permanently at war, and even after this, the lesser Khans of the empire only really paid lip service to Kublai. So being a Mongol in charge of what was a predominantly Chinese empire meant that Kublai had to adopt a combined means of rule. The Mongols were too outnumbered to simply fight everything, plus they weren't really ones for administration. Kublai thus expanded the Chinese bureaucracy, although ethnic Chinese subjects were barred from high-ranking positions. Most high-ranking offices, like those in the army, were filled by Mongols, whereas those in the bureaucracy were filled by skilled foreigners who had been moved from across the empire. Kublai also sought to improve the Chinese economy. The first thing he did was promise the Chinese that they...
Who had been moved across the empire? So did they basically just like distribute foreigners in these different locations for a certain reason? I'm assuming they had to basically threaten to kill them or move in order to make that happen.
That they wouldn't be mistreated, which to be fair to him, he did keep his word. To supplement this, he reformed the law codes, which despite the reputation of the Mongols as harsh rulers, were actually much more lenient than the Song down south. Kublai's religious policies can largely be summed up as because he was a Tengriist and had no interest in non-Mongols following his religion, which was tied to the land from which he came. He allowed Buddhists, Muslims, Nestorian Christians and Taoists freedom of worship in places at his court, which for the time was basically unheard of. So Kublai began to take on the characteristics more akin to the preceding Chinese emperors than any of the great Khans that came before him. He relocated the capital twice, first from Karakoram to Shangdu, before constructing a new capital called Dadu or Kanbalik next to the ruins of the old city of Zhongdu. He also made his claim to legitimacy by creating a brand new Chinese imperial dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. Despite all of this, Kublai was still a Mongol Khan, so his mind was interested in one thing: sweet, sweet conquest. He first demanded that the Japanese submit to him, they said no, and so he invaded. It went poorly. Also, Korea finally submitted, which was nice.
Yeah, how would you invade Japan back in this time? There's really no good way to do it, right? Because you would have to take ships over to Japan and then basically land on their shores and take over, which I would imagine would be really, really difficult logistically to pull off back in this time. So I'm not really surprised it went poorly, but man, you really do have to be power hungry to at least attempt that.
Was nice. Of course, Kublai's main target was obviously the southern Song dynasty, since he wanted to be the emperor of all of China. Progress here was much slower since the Song were formidable, wealthy opponents. Kublai was ultimately successful though, and by 1279 the Song dynasty was no more and the Yuan dynasty was in control of the entirety of China. It was during the height of Kublai's power that he was visited by a man from the west, a certain Venetian called Marco Polo. Polo could travel across the Mongol Empire due to what is called the Pax Mongolica.
Marco Polo, of course. I mean, we learn about him as being a great explorer. Well, I say that with hesitation because I don't know what Marco Polo did exactly. I do remember studying about him in school and how he was kind of an explorer. I think he did come over to the Americas as well. I mean, I hope he was an okay guy, but I don't know. We'll have to learn more about him.
Mongolia, the Mongol peace. The Mongol Empire was for the most part extreme empire created by a man from the west, a certain Venetian called Marco Polo. Polo could travel across the Mongol Empire due to what is called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The Mongol Empire was for the most part extremely safe to travel across, and this facilitated massive amounts of trade across what is known as the Silk Road. This same route would later allow the bubonic plague to travel from China to Europe, but during the late 13th century it was a positive. The Silk Road allowed for
So the bubonic plague came from China?
Artisans, merchants and intellectuals to move across the world and gave Kublai access to the greatest minds of the age with which to run his empire. He made more attempts to invade Japan in the 1280s, which all met with typhoon-related disaster. He also tried to finish off Day Viet, but once again the Mongols failed. Kublai also tried to conquer India as his predecessors had, but again, like his predecessors, he failed. Kublai had other struggles, the most notable.
Why is that? Why was he not able to conquer India? Now, obviously, I've watched a couple of videos on India, but I'm still not knowledgeable enough yet on the timelines, like who was in India during this time, what empire was ruling at this time, what was India's military like at this time. Obviously, it was pretty formidable if the Mongols weren't able to take it.
The most notable being his capacity to exert influence over the other Mongol Khans. Kaidu, the leader of the Chagatai Khanate, was in open rebellion against Kublai, and the Il Khanate and the Golden Horde were doing their own thing, meaning the Mongol Empire was well and truly fractured at this point. Kublai would continue his rule until his death in 1294, after which the Mongol Empire would only ever decline. So what was the legacy of the Mongol Empire? Genghis and his descendants had built the largest contiguous empire in human history and waged wars of unimaginable destruction.
Okay, so that kind of answers my question about the size of the empire. So this was the largest contiguous empire, but the British Empire would still be the biggest because it kind of spread all over the world, so that makes sense. It was the biggest according to land area, but the Mongol Empire was the biggest kind of single connected area as far as empires go.
Many regions were ravaged and depopulated, and the death toll of the conquest was in the many millions, which in the 13th century was a sizable percentage of the human population. The Mongols destroyed centres of commerce and learning, but also built an empire which in the end facilitated them. Genghis is remembered as history's greatest conqueror, and Kublai is remembered.
I'm gonna have to learn more about that, kind of how the Mongol Empire, again, it said it destroyed a lot of centers of learning, but also it facilitated them as well. So I have to kind of figure out how that worked.
Remembered for his religious tolerance and competent rule. The four Khanates would soon come to resemble those they had conquered and would abandon the Mongol traditions and religion. The Yuan dynasty became fundamentally Chinese, the Ilkhanate Persian, and in the end they left little trace that they had descended from nomads who'd conquered a world. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching.
Alright guys, so that was the video on the Mongolian Empire. Now obviously there's way more to learn than what was in that little 10-minute video, but I did learn quite a bit more about the Mongolian Empire. Now I wonder, is modern day Mongolia kind of like the descendants of the Mongolian Empire? Is that kind of what's left of it? And also, are the modern day Chinese and like the Persians also descendants of the Mongols? So was like the Mongol DNA kind of mixed in with these cultures? So anyway, thank you for indulging me today and allowing me to watch something on the Mongolian Empire. I do think it's important to learn about Asian history because to me it kind of relates back to European history and the British history and the British Empire. So to me it all kind of ties together. Now your video suggestions are a bit all over the place in history, which is totally cool with me because I want to learn it all. And the more I learn, the more I see how everything kind of ties together. Asian history ties together with European history at a certain point, which ties together with American history, and all of it kind of ties the whole entire world together. And that's what this channel is about learning about the world and also space, because space fascinates me. It's one of my favorite things, so we will be getting into some stuff about like the universe as well. So thanks for watching, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe, and also leave some comments down below answering my questions if you can, or if you have anything to add. I do read them and I appreciate them. There's plenty more coming your way, so be patient, stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.